we've gotten to a state culturally and socially within the past 5 years where mental health has been a subject that it's good that we talk about it, and it's good that we have brought that conversation to the forefront of social media, and talking about people need to go to therapy and really consider that part of your, like, just like the same way you look at going to the gym as being healthy. Like, we need to talk about maintaining your mental health as well. That's great. But we have also gotten to a point where there has kind of been this weird, like, fetishization of mental health, to the point where now, like, you go on certain people's Twitter bios and, like, they'll have their fucking, like, ADHD, OCD, like bipolar. They'll have it, like, in their Twitter bio, as if, like, having ADHD is, like, a personality now. It's like, that's not, like, it's like a badge of honor almost, that people, like, in the same, like, I don't know how to describe what I'm saying, but it's almost like we've embraced it to a fault, to the point where we're no longer acknowledging the fact that it's like, yes, we acknowledge that these are things that people deal with, but also the main purpose here is to, if you're dealing with certain obstacles and hurdles in your life, that the ultimate goal is always to overcome them. You know what I mean? Like, it would be one
but
thing.
Also, like, Twitter's not a good representation of, like, the world.
Well, we've gotten in this conversation about, I think we talked about with Archie, we talked about several times on the podcast about depression, and how, like, in the way that, like, antidepressants are, like, the biggest grossing medicine that's sold, like, that's the number one sold, like, pharmaceutical is antidepressants, and how this idea of, like, if you're feeling shitty, if you don't enjoy your day-to-day existence, blah, 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 that this idea that it's entirely chemical and it's entirely outside of your control has kind of been the enforced way of looking at it in our society. And it's always bugged me that no one's ever taken a step back and been like, wait, isn't it a coincidence that also happens to be the way of looking at it that makes Big Pharma the most money? Like, has it ever occurred to anyone?
I mean, it's kind of like the same thing with, like, I guess, like, Ritalin for people our age. Like, because when it was being, like, heavily pushed, it was, like, when we were going through school and shit. Like, I knew a lot of people who had, like, whatever, fucking Ritalin or, like, Adderall or whatever the fuck. But it was mainly just because it was being kind of, like, pushed on our generation. Like, kind of like, oh, these kids are, like, rambunctious and have a lot of energy. It's not because they're kids. It's because they have ADHD.
Yes.
But also, that is a real thing. Like, some people do need that shit for people do really have ADHD, but it's something that was, like, overprescribed to people who didn't have it.
100%. And, like, I always joke and be like, ADHD isn't real, blah, blah, blah. And, like, to be honest, I know that there are some crazy cases of it out there, but I also know that
I feel like most people have, like, mild forms of it.
And I was diagnosed with it, for whatever that's worth. Not, whatever the way anyone else is diagnosed with it. You just get in trouble in class enough, and then they bring in a school psychologist who had never met me, and he goes, oh, you have it. And if that's what happened to me, I can only imagine that's what's happened to millions of other kids across the country over the past 20 years. And so, as someone who was diagnosed with it and given the option of taking prescription drugs to overcome it, I was given that option. I can
making air quotes for shit that happened.
It happened, but, like, it's so
diagnosed, prescribed medicine.
It's hard for me to
put on supervisor watch.
All that did happen, but here's the thing. It's so incredibly difficult for me to acknowledge that as real, because the way that I saw it happening in my mind, from my perspective, was I went to school and I did not think that a lot of the shit that we were doing had a purpose. I was much more interested in things that ultimately wound up being the more important things in my life.
For sure.
And you and I and people like us that were stuck in that system were told basically, like, that was the thing. And we've talked about this before as well, but, like, I was thinking about this the other day, that, like, just in the same way that we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, no one ever told me, very few people, I mean, there were very few people in my life in terms of my teachers that really enforced the idea in my mind that the things that I was doing the things that would get me in trouble could have actually been beneficial assets in my adult life. Like the fact that I enjoyed making people laugh and being an entertainer and doing things like that. There were so many qualities that I exhibited from a young age that were kind of squashed down. And they were used by that psychologist and my teachers at the time to, air quotes, diagnose me with a disorder, where ultimately very many of those traits that they said were a disorder wound up being what made me into at this juncture in my life, a successful in whatever I'm doing.
Yeah.
That
it
those
might be kind of like double-edged though, just because like if they had not been so negative to it, because I feel like kids want to do the opposite of anyone, like whatever anyone tells them, and I don't think like the adults in the situation, like the teachers or whatever, were consciously doing that. But like I feel like you getting in trouble for doing that, but you get the positive response of the class or whatever, that makes you want to do it more, and like you then get a sense of like, you know, the positive and negatives of situations, and then you try to like get away with it smoother the next time, but you still do it.
Yeah, but ultimately you're still reinforcing in that kid's mind that somewhere along the line you're getting negative reinforcement for positive things. And I'm not saying that like showing up late to class is a good thing. I'm not saying that like being disruptive is a good thing.
There's a method to the madness.
But like certainly there are ways to ring it in. And like, okay, we see this kid, we see what he brings to the table, and like here are the things that we need to dial in so that we can, but that really wasn't what was happening in a lot of situations. In a lot of situations, the stuff that I would get in trouble for, I think about times when I would get detention for writing in my notebook the lyrics to songs and stuff like that because I wasn't paying attention to class. No one ever told me that, hey, did you know the fact that you can memorize a bunch of lyrics to a bunch of songs could actually make you money when you're an adult? Nobody told me that. They gave me detention for it. Same thing I did with wrestling. When I would go through and I'd write down I was always been a list guy. You said it yourself. I'm a list guy.
Love lists.
I would write down every match by memory and the exact score and figure out who I was wrestling next and blah, 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 blah. And I would do that. And then fucking my calculus teacher sees me doing that the day of states and tries to not let me go to states because I wasn't paying attention to his math class. And Mr. Brocky had to come and actually physically talk to the teacher and allow him to let me leave for the bus midday to go to states. So that kind of shit that wound up later on in life playing a beneficial role in my life, attributes that I had, I spent my entire life being told by thankfully not the people closest to me, like my family, but the people that were like in my life on a day-to-day basis. Many teachers, and I had many great teachers as well. But I still say to this day, the vast majority of things I learned in life were not from school itself, but were from sports. That was where I learned how to you know, apply myself and do things like that. Whereas in school, it was like, it's not just about figuring out what works for you. It was about, look, we're training you, and this is what always bugged me.
Yeah, we're training you to have a day job.
Exactly. We are training you how to work for someone else. And everyone who's teaching you is someone who works for someone else. So you're being taught by a bunch of people who have spent their entire lives in the system. The school, and this is no shade to teachers because there was plenty of awesome teachers in my life that I could talk about ad nauseum. But the vast majority of my experience across the board with some of the shittier ones was that you're learning how to live life and how to exist, and for a person that was bound to be outside of that system, being told by a bunch of people that have never been outside of that system that the way they're going about it is wrong because they have no concept. Nobody told me you could make money playing music. I had to figure that out myself. Nobody told me you could do any, like, these were things that other kids were told from the time they were kids. Oh, you can do this, and if you do your homework every night, then that means you're going to be a good employee, and that means you're going to show up on time to your day job 9 to 5, and you're going to do that stuff on time. And it's like, great, you're giving these kids a clear-cut path to how to do what they want to do. You're telling them you go to high school and get good grades in high school so you can go to good college. You get good grades in college so you can get a good job. And you have clearly set out the path for these kids to do what they are bound to do in life. But at no point did you ever clearly set out the path for kids like us to show us that, hey, Also, maybe you aren't as interested in this stupid, mundane, repetitive, mindless bullshit, but also you have things that you bring to the table that could make you a successful person in what you do. Was never told to me. Instead, that was diagnosed as a disorder. And that's why I air quote it. So it makes me wonder how many kids...
You get so riled up when I bring this up. You getting diagnosed.
It makes me wonder how many kids are put through that. And that's what I mean by the fetishization of mental health, is that I was lucky enough to grow up in an environment, in my home environment, where when they told me I had the disorder, instead of being told, okay, well, here's a crutch that you can rely on for the rest of your natural born life, here is some fucking amphetamines, so that if you can't dial down the shit that makes you want to be entertaining, or the shit that makes you want to be creative, or the shit that makes you want to do any of this stuff, instead we're going to give you fucking Ritalin, we're going to give you speed, we're going to give you fucking legalized meth so that you sit down and shut the fuck up and do exactly what we tell everybody else in this fucking classroom to do. And that, it's impossible to tell how many kids are going through that right now. I've seen personally, and I know you've seen this as well, a lot of the kids that were all drugged up through our high school years and middle school years wound up to be kind of fucking weird. A lot of them. And that's not a coincidence, because they never learned regular fucking coping mechanisms. When you grow up, when you're a young kid who instead of being told to sit down and shut the fuck up, and if you don't, this is the consequence. If instead of teaching them consequence, and instead of teaching them how to, like I said before, ring it in. Hey, it's great that you're energetic. It's great that you're creative. It's great that you think outside the box. It's great that you want to be entertaining. Blah, 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 blah. But also, here's the confines of society that you need to learn. You need to show up to class on time. You need to not be disruptive. You got to know when is the right time to be funny and when is the right time to sit down and listen. Those are things that you should be taught. But when you just tell any kid who thinks like that it's actually not something that could be beneficial to them later in life, that instead it is some type of fucking disease. It's a disease to not be like everyone that you're sitting next to in your classroom. It's impossible to tell how many kids are going through that now. It's impossible to tell. So, but that all stems from this idea that mental health or having hurdles in your mind, having obstacles that deter you from being able to achieve something cannot be overcome, that instead it is something to identify with and just say, well, this is me. And so here's my pill that I take, and I'm going to start taking that from the time I'm 8 years old, and I'm never going to be able to function without it. I'm never going to learn baseline, regular coping mechanisms so that if randomly one day I don't have access to my pill, I can't fucking function. And I'm not trying to say that about Simone Biles. I'm not trying to say about anyone in particular. But the reason I say that this situation with the mental health thing doesn't happen 5 years ago is because even 5 years ago, we at least had an expectation that people were like, okay, look, we understand like there's a lot of pressure, but that's also like what this shit is, dude. It's the Olympics. It's a 2,000-year-old tradition. This is the one time every 4 years that people even give a fuck about what you're doing. And you've been saying you're the greatest of all time, and this is your time to fucking prove it. And if you can't rise to the occasion, no one's mad at you. But it's a way bigger thing to say, we accept you, we're okay with your decision, than to instead flip that on its head and say that that's bravery.